Did somebody say Khrysalis? Khrysalis is a world that seems to get very mixed opinions from the community, and saying that might even be too generous, because the general reception of this world tends to be much more on the negative side of things. Khrysalis is a world that I have quite a lot to say about, and I just so happen to have a character questing through the world, so I've decided to make a video about it. I'm going to be taking you through my wizard's journey through Khrysalis, and trying to take an objective look at the world, as well as explain some of the reasons that I personally think that this world is underrated. But who knows, maybe my opinion will change. The first part of Khrysalis can be divided up into 3 areas: Tyrian Gorge, Moon Cliffs, and Last Wood. I mean this too. You don't enter an area outside of these 3 zones until well over 100 quests in, which is more quests than the entire world of Dragonspire, by the way. You're probably wondering how the game manages to pull this off, having so many quests between these different areas. While some people would argue that the game doesn't pull this off, I think it's actually a lot more tolerable than it sounds, because of some design choices. What do I mean by design choices? I mean the order in which the game has you do these areas, which is no real order. Instead of doing an area, which then leads to the next area, a different approach is taken. Instead of the usual approach, Khrysalis has you go back and forth between 3 areas for quite the long stretch. This almost leads to the big 3 areas feeling like one big area, since there isn't really a big sense of completion when you keep returning to the same areas. However, do I think that this is a bad thing? Not necessarily. I like that the world switches up the scenery every 6 or 7 quests. It keeps things somewhat interesting, and the visual style of these 3 areas differ enough that they feel like a substantial change in scenery. In my opinion, this is much better than a world like Dragonspire, for example, which is more traditional in its quest line, but never really changes up the scenery or vibe. All the areas just kind of feel samey. Yeah, that's right, I think the entirety of Dragonspire is more monotonous than the first 3 areas of Khrysalis. And that's because Khrysalis is just well done. I realize this is a very bold claim to make, and don't worry, I'm gonna back myself up soon enough. But before I do that, I want to get into some of the positives and negatives that I experienced through Khrysalis. Keep in mind, this list is mainly going to be about part 1, because I didn't end up taking as many notes about part 2, but we'll get into that later. Here's a few of the negatives I found. In Tyrian Gorge, you can and will get pulled by the 100 Lickers. Take note of the distance I had between them and still got pulled anyways. Yeah, this happens all the time. Blue Razors are fought quite often, and they use a lot of shields, and they also have stuns. They're quite the annoying mob to fight, especially considering how often you have to fight them. By the time the world is over, you never want to see a Blue Razor ever again. Flame Legs are another mob that you fight very often. There's only one location where you can fight these, and they share a space with Blood Hornets, another mob you need quite often. However, when you need these mobs, it's not usually both at the same time, so it often leads to pulling mobs that you don't want. Whenever you need Blood Hornets, there are plenty of Flame Legs, and whenever you need Flame Legs, there's plenty of Blood Hornets. This section never really seemed to work out in my favor, and it was always really annoying trying to pull the right mob. Just kind of a weird design choice in this area. Mobs really like debuffs and shields in this world, making your average street fight a little bit more difficult than average. I don't particularly mind this though, cause it can break up some of the repetitiveness of just blading into an AoE attack. It's kind of fun when you have to put more strategy into it. Here's a few of the positives I found. Khrysalis introduces companions, aka Divum Whiteheart, a companion who gives you an additional 50 damage, which is extremely helpful. It also makes you feel really powerful. It's just super fun to use. I like this feature of the game a lot, and it's something that we see return pretty consistently, though no other companion truly compares to Divum. At around level 95, I got to Eclipse Tower, and this is one of my favorite parts of Khrysalis. The cutscene where you unlock it and the light bridge comes up to the tower is really cool. Not to mention that this is where you first get Shadow Magic. Shadow Magic is something that you're going to be using for the rest of the game. It's a very important feature, and it just feels great to finally unlock it. It's really fun. You meet a character named Zam, who's just a funny little guy, and then you have to dance to unlock an instance. It's really funny. The soundtrack here is phenomenal, and it's one of my favorites in the game. There's also this scene where your wizard grows really big, and it's just really funny looking, and it makes me laugh. Like, look how goofy this looks. You get to unlock a 4th potion slot fairly early into the world. You gain access to extra pip decks in this world, which are extremely helpful and change up the meta. There was this really cool section where you had to polymorph into Morganthe to fight against other enemies, and it changed up how you fought, and I thought it was really cool because it got you using spells that you wouldn't usually use. That about wraps up all the positives and negatives that I have for Khrysalis. I might be missing some, but most of them should be there. Overall, it was mainly positives, but a few of the negatives were so prominent that it became really annoying at some points. Anyways, after a little over 100 quests, it's time to go to the last area of part 1, Fort Riachus. Righteous? I don't know how to say it, I'm sorry. Anyways, I like this area. It's pretty cool. There's some cool moments here, like when you have 3 different companions at once, all offering you different kinds of buffs. It really feels like a climax when you're walking down that hall and have 3 different people following you. The final boss of part 1 here is Ghost Dog, who is hard enough if you solo, but if you get a friend's help, it's not going to be a problem. And that about wraps up part 1. Before I talk about part 2, I want to talk about exactly why this world feels so fun and different to me. The biggest reason I think Khrysalis is a fun world is because of the progress you get to see your character make. Before the end of part 1, you've been introduced to a few new things, like companions and shadow magic, but there's one massive pace breaker that I think makes all the difference. That is Darkmoor. You see, Darkmoor is an essential dungeon of the game, strategically placed at level 100, which is right around the time you'll be finishing up part 1 or early part 2 of Khrysalis. I know, Darkmoor is not technically part of Khrysalis, but I grouped the two together because 99% of players will stop mid-Khrysalis to go to Darkmoor. Getting Malistaire gear from Darkmoor is something that I always like to do for my wizards, as the gear is a major upgrade and makes you much more powerful. The gear isn't exactly easy to get though, as most of you know this. It can take anywhere from a few hours to a few weeks to complete a set. It's very unpredictable. However, if you choose to go for the gear, I find it almost always provides a substantial break from Khrysalis when it's needed the most. When I start getting tired of Khrysalis, Darkmoor swoops in to rescue me and changes up the scenery completely. By the time you get all your gear and come back from Darkmoor, and you're ready to quest in Khrysalis again, you're a completely different wizard. Your stats will be on another level that they were never at before, and if you're a Storm or a Death wizard, you come back with a new spell that you'll be using for the rest of the game. This newfound power makes Khrysalis fun again. You get to go back to the same world, but this time, you mean business. At this point, you're unstoppable. You've mastered shadow magic, and your stats are better than ever. In fact, I would consider this moment in the game the biggest power shift you will have for your character. This here is the core reason that I think Khrysalis is a fun world. There is genuine progress for your character. Growth. Which is not something that happens a lot in this game. It's rare for a world to make you feel like you progress so much as a character. Other worlds that do this well, for example, would be Celestia with astral magic, or Polaris introducing you to the Arcanum. It just feels good to get stronger, and Khrysalis does a great job of making you stronger. I feel like this take is definitely gonna get me some backlash, because like I said, Darkmoor isn't really part of Khrysalis, but it's honestly my opinion. I just associate Darkmoor with Khrysalis so heavily, and I'm sure a lot of other people do. It just feels like an honorary part of Khrysalis. I always stop mid-Khrysalis to go there. I know most people do too. And because of this, it makes me look forward to Khrysalis. Just having the air of knowing that, hey, Darkmoor is coming up, that makes Khrysalis better. And I think that counts. That counts as making Khrysalis a better world. Now, let's finally talk about part 2. I took my hiatus from Wizard101 before I could really write notes about part 2, so I have a bit less to say about it. Part 2 features more areas than part 1 did, and sticks to that more linear form of progression. The new areas in part 2 are Crescent Beach, Ruined Alcazar, Radiance Reborn, Sardonyx, Conda Desert, Solar Arc, The Hive, and the Shadow Palace. substantially more areas than Part 1, so if you didn't like the formula there, Part 2 is probably more enjoyable for you. I don't have too much to say about these areas. My favorite area here is probably the Shadow Palace, but also want to give a shout out to the ruined Alcazar for having the giant blue crab guy. He's my favorite. Part 2 is pretty smooth sailing. There are some difficult bosses, but with your new gear, none of them should pose too big of a threat. I find this part of the world enjoyable, but just a tinge forgettable. Especially the Sardonyx and Conda Desert areas. I always forget that these areas are in the game and have to say, oh, yeah, I forgot about this whenever I get to them on a new character. Whenever I was taking notes for Khrysalis, I didn't write much down about Part 2 because it was just kind of a basic world. It felt very vanilla. There was nothing bad about it, nothing significantly great. There's this one dungeon where you ride the Great Beast to ruined Alcazar, and I think that's a pretty cool dungeon. But up until the Shadow Palace, it's a pretty vanilla experience. There is one area here that stands out above the rest though, and that's the Shadow Palace. The shortest area in Khrysalis, and where the climax happens, this area is dark and spooky, and where you'll finally be fighting Morganth, a fight you've been teased with since Celestia. Once you get here, you know what's about to go down. The atmosphere here is nailed. With intense music and great scenery, you know this is a final area. It's not an easy area either. When you first enter, you have to face off against 4 bosses at once with this really cool tree fight. After that, you have to do a really hard dungeon with bosses you fought to prior in the world. It's always fun to see callbacks. At this point in the world, you're going to need a team. It's hard. Getting by solo is a pain and not something that you want to do. It depends on what kind of player you are, but personally, I really appreciate this. If the end of the world is going to feel climactic, I want it to feel like a challenge, and Khrysalis does this pretty well. Better than a lot of worlds in this game, I would argue. So, you beat the dungeon, and now it's time to fight Morganth. She takes on her 4 different spider forms, and you know what you have to do. Kill. And yes, you do kill. Once you win, Morganth falls to her doom into the cold embrace of space. I guess. I don't really know, but, she dead. Overall, the final fight is a pretty fun one, but not too hard. If you choose to solo the fight, it would be pretty hard and difficult, but if you go in with a team of 4 people, it's not going to be too much of a challenge for you. I would consider the dungeon before the Morganth fight to be the real challenge of the world, because sadly, the strategy for the Morganth fight is the dreaded blade into AoE. While this is a bit disappointing, I can forgive this fight purely for the cinematics. I like it. And with that, you are done with Khrysalis and ready for Polaris. Just to recap, my overall opinion of Khrysalis is that it's above average, and even charting into the territory of being a personal top 5 favorite worlds for me. But I can see why someone could easily disagree with that. If I had to give Khrysalis a rating out of 10, I would give it a 7. It does a great job of making you feel like you've grown up, and a great job of bringing closure to the second arc. But the repetitiveness and sometimes blandness of the world brings it down a few points. So what do you think? Was taking a deeper look at Khrysalis and how it works enough to make you like it or appreciate it a little bit more? Let me know. And as always, see you later, Wizard Gators.